All right, so next up we'll have a presentation from Ansel Klein.
Okay, all right, thank you. Hi everyone. I'm Faith Kearns, and it is truly an honor to introduce my colleague and friend Ansel Klein today. I first met Ansel 10 years ago, just as I had returned to working with the University of California after a few years away. And Ansel was working with the Pacific Institute. And I remember meeting this very, very smart, open-hearted and shy, but also very curious young person who was sitting across a table from me in a conference room in downtown Oakland. And it really wasn't very long before I was thoroughly impressed by this beautiful video that Ansel created about the work that almond grower Tom Rogers was doing to save water during the start of our last long drought in California. And we soon began to talk about grad school, and you can very much see the through line from that video, the sort of first way that I met Ansel to her interdisciplinary dissertation research, where she is listening to and honoring organic farmers' specialized knowledge using both qualitative and quantitative research approaches. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that work in Ansel's presentation today. I will also note that I have long been impressed by Ansel's spacious, artistic, creative work in soils and other earth media, which aims to explore different and complex ways of knowing, and actually meshes perfectly with Ansel's scientific work, dissertation work. So whether Ansel is riding a bike across the southwestern deserts of the United States or surfing the California coast, it is really guaranteed to be an adventure. And I truly cannot wait to see what Ansel does next, because I know no matter what, it will be a values-driven life that is uniquely occupied with both science and art in mind. So without further ado, introducing the brilliant Ansel Klein.
Thank you, Faith, for such a grounding introduction, and thank you for believing in me from the very beginning. It truly feels full circle to have you here to send me off as I finish this journey, so thank you. And thank you to all who are joining here. Today, I'll be sharing one chapter of my dissertation work. And before I do that, I just wanted to give the bigger picture of this dissertation and start with a brief overview of the body of work. So here it is, Widening the Frame, Farmer Knowledge, Soil Nutrient Dynamics, and On-Farm Management on Organic Farms in an Agricultural Landscape of Northern California. So for me, in returning to grad school, soil really was the starting point for this work. Soil is home to thousands of organisms. It's right below our feet. It creates the unique conditions for plants to thrive. And it is also the foundation from which our food grows and from which farmers create their livelihoods. And so after graduating from Berkeley as an undergrad, I was lucky enough that most of my friends became farmers all over California. And through my farmer friends, I met other farmers and also widened my network of farmer acquaintances through working at the Pacific Institute here in Oakland. And I quickly began to learn just how knowledgeable farmers were, and that while there was all this high-level policy work and academic research happening, farmers really didn't have a seat at the table. So this dissertation takes a deep dive into documenting, understanding, and uplifting farmer knowledge and farmer voices through academic research. So I decided to take a case study approach and work with a community of 13 organic farmers who represent a significant node of the organic movement in California. I focused my work in an area that spans Patwin-speaking Winton Nation lands, or Yolo County, and I worked primarily with white settler organic farmers who were considered back to the landers. So these were mostly urban folks who decided to come back to rural lands and take up farming alternatively, mostly starting in the late 80s and 1990s. And this community of farmers were therefore mostly first or second generation farmers, so relatively new to farming, and farmers who, despite being new to the landscape, had also begun to accrue local place-based knowledge and direct experience. And because soil fertility was and still is so central to the organic movement, for these farmers, soil was a particular focus. So my dissertation spans 3 chapters, and I attempt to widen the frame around how we can intersect farmer knowledge, soil nutrient dynamics, and on-farm management. And my first chapter documents farmer knowledge of soil in this region. My second chapter does a deep dive into available soil indicators to measure aspects of soil nutrient dynamics. And then my third chapter attempts to integrate farmer knowledge of soil fertility and how available indicators for soil fertility overlap with this. So as I mentioned earlier, I'll be focusing on this last chapter here, and it's entitled Soil Health and Fertility Management and Practice, a case study of farmer knowledge and soil fertility indicators on working organic farms in a region of Northern California. So again, in this last chapter, I center this tension between, on the one hand, we know that farmers possess deep knowledge of their farming systems and their soil, and on the other hand, academic researchers in agriculture and soil science place a great deal of emphasis on using available soil indicators to provide insight to soil health status and soil nutrient levels. And how can we put these two knowledge systems that have a vested interest in soil health more in conversation? So before I dive in, I just wanted to quickly review some of these terms I've been throwing around, like soil health, soil fertility. And a helpful starting point is the USDA NRCS. And their work includes recently codified aspects of soil health, or their so-called principles of soil health. And the NRCS defines soil health as the continued capacity of soil to function in a way that sustains ecological, environmental, and human needs. And we can also think about soil health as a concept that's in dialogue with other aspects of farming via a complex interactive web. As on the right here, we see that it can include things like productivity, soil functioning, soil fertility, and that these concepts are all interrelated and still actively being understood and applied in agricultural systems. So the concept of soil health is really interlinked with these other aspects of soil management. And in this chapter, I focused on soil fertility, which is defined as the capacity of soil to be able to provide nutrients to crops. And I use this as the language through which to unpack this complex web of soil management. So with this backdrop, I focus on 3 questions. First, how do farmers conceive of soil fertility on their farm? What nutrients do farmers think about in managing for soil fertility? Second, do commonly available metrics for diagnosing soil nutrient levels inform farmer fertility programs and/or management? And then third, can commonly available soil metrics detect differences between fields deemed by farmers as either most challenging and least challenging in terms of soil fertility? So I took an interdisciplinary place-based approach that combined qualitative and quantitative methods. I interviewed these organic farmers during an initial field visit and then later more in depth in person to really understand how these farmers thought about soil health, soil fertility, and soil nutrient dynamics on their farm. And I also sampled their fields at peak vegetative growth in the summer of 2019 to assess soil indicators for soil fertility. And farmers were involved in the selection of fields and were asked to select fields on their farm that were either most challenging or least challenging in terms of maintaining on-farm soil fertility, such that one field, field A, represented the higher end of soil fertility, and field B represented the lower end of soil fertility on each farm. I also I measured 8 soil indicators on each of these farms on both fields, so the most and least challenging fields. And these indicators focused on soil nitrogen cycling and soil organic matter related to soil fertility. I also recorded management practices for each farm, including information about crop diversity, cover cropping, tillage, whether they integrated crop livestock systems, their crop rotation patterns, and the amount of additional nitrogen-based fertilizers that they used on farm. And in comparing the management practices across farms, I found that a gradient of management started to naturally emerge that was strongly driven by the amount of nitrogen-based fertilizer each farm applied, and that this gradient strongly differentiated into 3 levels of fertilizer input: low, medium, and high, which informed my analyses. So as you can see here, on the low end of fertilizer input, farmers were adding less than half a kilogram of nitrogen per acre, or in 2 cases, basically none at all. And then on the high end of fertilizer input, farmers were adding upwards of 100 kilograms of nitrogen per acre, so 2 orders of magnitude greater than the low input range. So what I found through these multiple lines of inquiry, first, in terms of defining soil health, I found that farmers defined this concept rather similarly, using similar talking points and even similar language. They emphasize aspects such as supporting soil life, promoting diversity, minimizing compaction and disturbance to the soil, maintaining good soil structure and moisture, and that they also tended to use crops as an indicator for soil health to gauge the effectiveness of these aspects of soil health I just listed above. And so stepping back, I found that for these farmers at least, defining soil health was informed both by the history and culture of the organic movement, and also by federal policy, and in particular, the NRCS. In terms of soil fertility and nutrient management, farmers had more divergent ways of talking about these concepts. Most farmers readily listed key nutrients that were important to soil management and communicated that nitrogen was a key nutrient to consider. And while a handful of farmers focused their fertility programs on tracking soil nutrient levels, the vast majority of farmers emphasized that tracking soil nitrogen levels was less important than other aspects of soil management. And that this general sentiment among these latter majority of farmers emphasized more that their fertility program was not about measuring or lining up nutrients, but it was about taking a more holistic approach that focused more on creating the conditions that promoted a soil plant microbe environment ideal for crop health and crop productivity. And then interestingly, in fact, several farmers even shifted conversation away from focusing on nutrients entirely, which suggests that to these farmers, at least, the focus on nutrients and nutrient management really missed the mark for them with regards to maintaining soil fertility on their farms. So to this end, most farmers also expressed that soil testing was not super useful to their farm operation, and they discussed several limitations that included the inconsistency they found in soil test results, the fact that soil test results often just confirmed what they already knew, that soil test results tended to focus on overcoming limitations to their soil by recommending adding more fertilizer, which most farmers did not see as something they wanted to do on their farms. Soil tests were also not very holistic, And they also lacked interpretation in a way that could actually inform farm management. So my first key takeaway based on this qualitative research was that though researchers tend to focus on nutrient cycling and nutrient availability in soil health research, for most farmers in this study, tracking nutrient levels was less important than other aspects of fertility management. And in fact, managing for soil fertility required a holistic approach that relied more on carefully orchestrated soil management practices rather than depending on organic nitrogen-based fertilizers. And so lastly, on the quantitative side, I compared farmer-selected fields. So field A, the least challenging field, and field B, the most challenging field in terms of maintaining on-farm soil fertility across 8 indicators that I showed before. And I found that only one of these indicators, total soil nitrogen, was significantly different between the 2 farmer-selected fields. However, as this comparison of farms along a gradient of increasing fertilizer application shows, in general, the most challenging fields had more often than not higher total soil nitrogen values than the least challenging fields, which is the opposite of what we would expect. So in general, higher total soil nitrogen is equated with higher soil fertility, but here we see the opposite outcome where fields that farmers deemed as most challenging or potentially on the low end of total soil nitrogen were actually the fields that showed up higher total soil nitrogen based on field sampling. In addition, I also looked at how the 8 different soil indicators for fertility mapped out in terms of the fertilizer input gradient I mentioned a few slides back, specifically when comparing the most and least challenging fields. And as you can see here in these radar plots, among farms with low fertilizer input, the 8 indicators are in general relatively similar between least and most challenging fields, though the mean values for each of these indicators for most challenging fields are ever slightly higher than the least challenging fields, which again is the opposite of what we would expect. And as fertilizer input increases, we can see that in the medium and high input farms, soil organic matter indicators are slightly higher for least challenging fields, as we would expect. But that the opposite is true for most of the soil nitrogen cycling variables, as you'll see here circled in orange. So these quantitative results really tied in with what I was also hearing from farmers about their reservations with soil indicators and the limitations of available soil indicators in practice. And farmers in this context emphasize that their soil chemical and biological processes related to soil fertility may potentially diverge from agriculture that was predominantly or exclusively fertilizer-based, and that several farmers hypothesized that available soil indicators were not sensitive to their alternative approaches to maintaining soil fertility. So focusing more on soil management practices rather than adding nitrogen-based fertilizers, and that was corroborated by field sampling results. So to conclude, I found that current scientifically developed metrics for measuring soil fertility do not align well with farmer-developed benchmarks for soil fertility, which brings me to my final thought that I will leave you with here today, which is that agricultural researchers need to collaborate more directly with farmers as part and parcel of the knowledge making and research process, because there's really so much more to uncover here. So with that, I would like to thank all the amazing collaborators on this work Thank you to each farmer who believed in this research, to Julie Guthman for inspiring the work, to Faith for your mentorship, friendship, and the introduction, to Liz Carlisle and Ethan Sayer for all the interview guidance, to Margaret Lloyd for all your on-the-ground wisdom, to Maria Mushimer for all the lab analysis guidance, and to the whole Berkeley Agroecology Lab, each and every one of you, especially Tim Bowles, my advisor, and all the undergraduate researchers without whom this work wouldn't have been possible. Zeltsin Angon Gonzalez, Oya Walker Van Els, Karen Arroyo, Aureli Ortiz, and Moe Semino, and to my dissertation committee, Tim, Celine Palwood, and Liz. Thank you all for listening. And thanks, Kelly, for organizing, and the SBM department for hosting me.
Thank you, Ansel. All right, thank you so much. We are running out of time a little bit, but I do want to offer the floor to anyone who has one short question. Looks like we got one. Wow. Yes, okay. Hold on just a moment. We'll get the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much. Is it on? Thanks, Ansel, so much. That was a really wonderful presentation, and the research really resonates for me. I have so many questions. I'll follow up later with a lot of them, but I guess one of them that I was wondering was, how are the farmers learning these skills? So if a lot of them are sort of new to this process, sort of first generation, are they mostly taking coursework? Are they looking online? Are they learning from other farmers nearby? Where are they getting some of these skills? And if it's not too long of a two-part question, how do you think that influences how they're viewing some of these, especially around the nitrogen testing?
That's a great question. Thank you. That is actually something I looked at in my first chapter, and I actually found that a lot of farmers mostly are learning how to farm by doing. So they're actually getting out on their fields and trying different things. And, they definitely read books on organic farming or influenced by certain ethos of farming. But by and large, a lot of farmers are just either watching other farmers and maybe not even talking to other farmers, but just observing them from a distance and seeing what other farmers are doing. So that was definitely a surprising finding from my first chapter, that for at least this group of farmers, they're very much doers and trying things in practice.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ansel. I encourage you to jump on our department YouTube channel where this is being live streamed if you want to make yourself available for additional questions, and if anyone has any extra questions for Ansel. So thank you so much. One more round of applause for